Yeah, it's interesting because a lot of people that have come on so far have really talked about, the underlying issues and the trauma and the reasons why we start down that path of addiction. And I think a lot of people don't look at that the way it needs to be looked at, and looking at, your inner child and what is going on that made you go down this path, which you plunge into in this work, right? That's the whole point of it, going back and finding out who you really are. And can you explain that?
Yeah, I think there's two things that are emerging for me to kind of discuss with this topic.
Yeah.
One is the underlying root causes that I've identified in conscious recovery. And it came from my own experience in recovery now for, 37 years. It's kind of wild.
Yeah.
And then also I'm working in the field for over 15 years. I've identified the root causes of addiction as unresolved trauma, spiritual disconnection, and toxic shame. And those are the three things that I have seen repeatedly show up. I'm not saying it's the only cause of addiction, but that is the one thing. Those three things seem to be showing up in 100% of the people I've ever worked with.
Just you saying that, I'm like, yep. You said it so much better than I could, because that's exactly it. And so what was your journey like into recovery?
Well, when I was 18 months sober and I was suicidal, I had been in 12-step and I was loving it. All the cliches, right? I was going to work. I wasn't hungover. I had friends. I was very happy. But then, like I said, all of this stuff started to show up that hadn't been addressed. And I found myself feeling really numb and really despondent, but mostly disconnected from my true nature. The foundational principle of conscious recovery is underneath all addictive behavior is an essential self that's whole and perfect. That was my journey at 18 months. And it came through a mentor. Her name is Mary Helen. She passed away in 1998, but she was the most enlightened person I had ever met.
Wow.
And being in her presence was something that was so incredibly powerful. And I started to understand, not through her teaching, but through her being, that she could see something in me that I had lost touch with. That I did come into the world as a whole and perfect being, and that I did get programmed to believe I was broken or damaged, not good enough, and not lovable. And that the journey of recovery wasn't a journey towards something, but a returning to something.
Wow. Yeah.
And that was a fundamentally different way of viewing it, because I felt like I was bad and wrong and I needed to work the steps or to discover how to be good again. And she came in and said, what if it's something completely different than that?
Yeah. How did you find her? Because here you are at 18 months, suicidal. And then how did that happen?
Well, I found her through 12-step meetings.
Okay.
I had seen her around, right?
Okay.
And she was 19 years sober, which at the time was like, I couldn't even talk to her. I was too afraid to even talk to her. She was like this goddess to me, right? And so I was very nervous around her in the beginning. But when it got really painful, she was someone who I knew would understand and be there and be supportive. And she would say to me in her beautiful Southern accent, "Darling, you're so precious." And I would feel like I was going to get sick because that was so incongruent with who I believed myself to be. And it wasn't just a thought, it was an energy I was holding. This energy of being closed, of being broken, of being not good enough. And so when she said that, I would have this visceral reaction and want to push away.
Yeah.
And there was something in that I became aware of. It's like, wow, here's this beautiful, enlightened person that can see that I, like everyone, underneath all of this stuff, is still a very precious person.
Yeah.
Why can't I see it for myself? What's that about? And I think that awareness became the beginning of the journey.
And why did you feel those ways about yourself?
When I think back, I remember being a pre-programmed human, which is basically under 5, and being so happy. So much joy, so much connection, so much love. I remember lying, at night looking up at the stars thinking, this vast universe is so beautiful, and how am I so lucky to be here? And I came into a family where what people said and what people did and the energy I felt were 3 totally different things. Everything looked really good on the outside. We had a 4-bedroom house, the 2 cars. everything seemed okay. But
Yeah.
there was an energy of experiencing my parents in a loveless marriage. And I found out just last year, or just this year, my dad told me that he knew he never wanted to marry my mother, but he was told that he was going to by someone in our church.
Oh, wow.
And so like what I was feeling was,
Yeah.
here's these two people who were pretending to be in love, but I could tell they were not. My dad and his brothers, we would probably or could possibly label as perpetrators. But back then, that wasn't really mentioned.
Yeah.
My mom and her sisters all had eating issues and all had been sexually abused. So they found each other.
Yeah.
And then I also remember watching on TV and seeing war for the first time. And I remember hearing the way a lot of the men in my life talked about women. And I remember my grandfather saying things that were overtly racist. And I remember my uncle, who was gay, but very deeply in the closet, being super homophobic. So all of that
Yeah.
led to me closing my heart at age 7 and building a wall that did protect me, but it protected me from the love and connection I truly desired.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's the story in one way or another for a lot of people. You know, I think back when I was really little, and I have a hard time remembering the innocence, like when things changed. You know, I just know that they changed, and I really struggled with belonging, with the thought of what is love. You know, what is, people talk about unconditional love. Well, what is that? You know, especially if you've been abused as a child, it can be very confusing. You know, being scared. I mean, I was just talking to somebody. It wasn't until just a few years ago that I feel like I grew past being scared. You know, I would, as an adult, go into my home. If I would get home, it didn't matter what time of day, and I'd go through the whole house, like gnarly PTSD, you know, and just that trauma response, and check every closet, look under the beds, had to have every light on, had to make sure all the doors, the windows were locked before I could feel safe, you know, and thankfully I don't do that anymore. But it started at a very, very young age, and it really set me up for, you know, going down that road of addiction, you know, and wanting to numb myself, but at the same time really questioning how I felt. Like, I feel like I could never really tap into how do I actually feel? What is real? What is not? What is going on? This doesn't make sense. Things like that, you know, until I probably got into my 4th or 5th year of recovery. Even the first few years were like super confusing still.
Yeah, it's interesting. As you're talking, I'm remembering my first, I mean, if I'm honest, 10 years of recovery, where I would say things like, I have these symptoms of someone who was sexually abused, but I don't remember that. And I would continuously see myself exhibiting behavior that was very clearly a response to something that happened.
Yeah.
And I remember having these flashes of memories of a being a very young child and dismissing them. And when in 2003, it's interesting, I know the year, but in 2003, my sisters and I went back to our small town that we grew up in. And we, you know, then you can knock on doors and ask to walk in the house. Because
Right.
not only did they say, oh, of course, but they knew who we were. Oh, you moved out in, 1970, whatever, right? So we went into all 3 of the homes that we lived in when we were little. And when I got to the stairs of the basement, I started literally having these convulsions and couldn't breathe. And then it was at that moment that I understood that something happened in that basement, and I probably wouldn't ever remember exactly what it was. And I had flashes of being like a 2-year-old. Right. And so I don't know if you relate to this, but I, for so long, thought if I can just figure out exactly what happened, then somehow I can fix it. And I've come to really understand it's less about what happened and more about what I decided about myself. And if you think about a 2-year-old, I didn't even have the cognitive ability.
Right.
So I'm guessing, and I know I shut down. And so that shutdown response was actually a brilliant strategy, even for a 2-year-old, not conscious, right? But what happened and why I'm saying all of this is we end up having an automatic response to a traumatic event from the past, thinking that it's about what's happening in real time. We often call it a trigger, but I call it an activation. The wound got touched. Bessel van der Kolk says, trauma doesn't show up as a memory, it shows up as a reaction.
Yeah, very true. Yeah, and I think if we could be more aware of that,
and the automatic response was something that kept us safe. So in my story, for example, if anything got intense, or if I found myself really attracted to someone, I would start feeling shame and I would numb out. Or if something got really intense, or I would witness something that seemed abusive, or I would see something on TV, hear a sound, I would just numb out.
Yeah.
Like, why am I so numb? I spent so long trying to figure out why I was numbing out. And I have come to understand that that was this automatic, what I call a brilliant strategy to survive that kept me safe as a 2-year-old, a 3-year-old, a 4-year-old. Of course, that's going to be automatic. It's not that it's a coping mechanism that we need to get rid of. It's looking at why it's there, in what ways has it been serving me, and then in what ways has it not been serving me, and how, like you say, I don't have to do that anymore. But that checking and those lights turning on, all of that was something that kept you feeling safe at some point, but I'm guessing it became outdated.
Right, yeah. And so how does one start down that journey of realizing what this really is and doing the work to move past it?
Well, it starts with what are the conditions of my life, right? Like me, I was like, wow, I have these symptoms. Like I'll find someone attractive and feel shame. That's really interesting. So I would spend a lot of time thinking, that's interesting. I wonder what that is about. A lot of it is questioning that. Again, it's not about like, let me figure out exactly what's wrong here, because there's nothing wrong here. I'm having some kind of response or reaction, and I'm going into an automatic response to whatever I'm experiencing. And so there are kind of 3 steps: awareness, awareness, and awareness, right?
Yeah.
I'm aware that this is happening. And in the very beginning, you mentioned it, the deeper work is about getting in touch with, not going back to the original trauma, but going back to what didn't get felt. The automatic response for me was to shut down. And that's a brilliant strategy. So we don't want to tell ourselves you shouldn't shut down. We want to start dialoguing with that and then start to ask questions like, where did this originate? When did I first start shutting down? In what ways is it brilliant? In what ways has it served me? In what ways has it not served me? And what do I truly desire? Because what I truly desired was love and connection, but I couldn't let it in. 1, I didn't feel worthy, but 2, and the deeper awareness is that I was in that reactivity of pushing people away because it didn't feel safe.
Yeah. And noticing those patterns. I mean, for me, I've kind of hopped around from relationship to relationship that I don't want to say toxic, but just that didn't serve me, and it was like really hard to identify that. And I feel like even my last relationship, it was really, it took me, several years in it to understand, okay, this isn't serving me, and being able to be okay with that and recognize it. What are the signs for people that they can start recognizing these behaviors?
Well, I think you're leaning into something that I want to explore because it's super popular in our culture now to say, get rid of toxic relationships. And usually when we say that, we usually identify the other person as toxic. Right. Or we call them a narcissist. That's the new thing.
That's the new thing, which has been said many times here already. Yeah. That it's the new thing. It's the new thing. Yeah.
And I understand that. And there's of course truth to all of that. Right. But does that really help us actually heal? So of course, if we're in an abusive relationship, we want to get out of it. But we could say every relationship is perfect because it's an expression of how I feel about myself.
Yeah.
Not from this is really important, not from a place of self-criticism or blame, but from a place of curiosity. I remember a series of relationships where I couldn't have chosen more of unavailable men, and I could get into all the details. It's not that exciting, but I kept thinking, because the why is, we hear why is not a spiritual question. Why do I keep attracting these? unavailable people. And it's really like I was attracted to them. I was choosing them because there was a frequency, right? So at age 7, when I closed my heart, I decided I was unlovable and unworthy. These are big decisions for a 7-year-old.
Yeah.
Those got concretized in my unconscious, and then I became that as a frequency. So I would walk into a room with 20 people, and I would choose the one who would confirm the core false belief. Now, I want to be really careful because we're not saying it's our fault that we're doing this or that we're bad or wrong for it. There's just no other possibility, right? So yes, it is about working out the relationship. And yes, sometimes relationships are toxic that we want to step away from. But the deeper work here is, how do I actually heal the vibration or the frequency, the core false belief that is causing me to continue to choose these relationships? Like in my case, these were wonderful people. Yeah. Like truly wonderful people, but could not have possibly been more unavailable.
Yeah. And that's like my last relationship. I have nothing bad to say, about him in particular. It was more of me growing and realizing, what I wanted and didn't want in my life, and finally being able to see that, because yes, I that was my past. I would go what I thought was a toxic, going from that to that to that. And in this victim state of mind, like, I just have the worst luck. These guys, they just keep coming into my life. What is going on? And it wasn't until I started having that self-awareness, aware, and having the accountability, like looking at my part in things. And today I can look at my part in things. And that is just so valuable, being able to do that. I encourage everybody to do that.
Well, and then once we start to ask what's my part in it, then we can go into the deeper part, what is the deep root cause of me desiring these relationships, right? And it's not, because sometimes people hear that we're saying, we're letting them off the hook. It's not even about that, right?
Yeah.
It's like forgiveness. It's not whether what they did was right or wrong or good or bad. It's like, I'm still holding on to this idea that it shouldn't have happened.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm still holding on to this idea that, he should just be better at communicating, or he should just be, more loving to me. And that can be true, but that is still putting our focus on the other person changing. And we know, I think most of us know, at least on some level, that we really can't change other people.
No.
But we can start to do the work of changing ourselves.
Yeah.
And it's not because there's something wrong. It's because there is something within us that is still out of alignment with the truth of who we are.
Yeah. And I just love that you say that there's nothing wrong.
Right.
Because so often it's, I need to fix this about myself. Why am I doing this? This is wrong. And that's where that shame comes in. And to change that mindset, which I'm sure must take, because I can still get stuck in those ways of thinking that way. So how long did it take you to change your mindset and go into that direction?
Every single day.
Work in progress.
Every single day. It's there's not a finish line, but what I can say for myself is I have a very different relationship with it now. Like, I understand that that's not who I am, these ideas, these beliefs. And something can happen and I can find myself slipping back into it. And again, it's not really slipping back into a thought. It's really like, I feel that energy again.
Yeah.
Right. And what's required in the moment for me is to take a moment, pause, and allow myself to feel. And you mentioned it, so I thought it'd be great fun, to explore more about what that actually means. Because if you look at a small child, what do they do with their emotions?
They show you.
They show you. And then what happens after they show you?
They usually feel better.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right? It can become so simple.
Yeah.
Like, oh my gosh, I'm angry.
I'm like, is this a trick question?
Right? Is this a trick question? Right? And it really isn't. It's like, let me feel what's present with no judgment. One thing I like to say is, what am I experiencing without the story? Right? Just let myself feel.
Yeah.
And just allow that, because what happens is people think if I feel this, I'm going to get enveloped or I'm going to get stuck. But the truth is, the resisting of the feelings is what's keeping us stuck.
Yeah. I had a guest on yesterday, Daria. I love you, Daria. Do you know Daria?
I don't think so.
Oh, you would love her. And it was her first time talking publicly about the loss of her father, who was her best friend, and he just passed a couple years ago. And she was very suicidal for many, many months. And, she came to the realization that she could not numb herself with medications, that she needed to feel those emotions in order to heal from it.
That's right.
And a lot of people, unfortunately, we want that quick fix. We want to take the Xanax or whatever it is, and not feel. But like what you're saying, part of the journey is to feel those emotions and to show them.
Yeah. And mostly it's about to honor ourselves in the midst of that, because it is true. If we look at what we do around death, it's bizarre, right? I think we unconsciously try to soothe someone instead of like allowing them to feel. I mean,
very true.
If a parent dies and they're grieving, that's the appropriate response. And yet we're like, oh, they're in a better place.
That's exactly what she said.
Oh, the suffering is ended. Yeah. All these things that we're doing, what we're really saying is like, all this feeling is uncomfortable.
Yeah. Yeah. So working through those emotions, I mean, what are your suggestions? How if you're working the conscious recovery way to feel those emotions, because that's like one of the biggest things for people, especially in early recovery, feeling those emotions. And a lot of times it takes people out because, they've numbed for so long and all of a sudden it's just whoosh, a waterfall of emotions and they don't know what to do with them.
Yeah. I think in the beginning, what I would say is it's not about just like sitting in there and just feeling all of it for an hour. Maybe it might be, but for many of us, and it's certainly true for me, is normally what I do right now is anything but feel. So can I try for 2 minutes just to say, what am I noticing, right? Maybe I put a hand. I remember my therapist when I was in my 20s was an engaged Buddhist. His name is Ken. He saved my life in so many ways. But he would say, where are you experiencing that in your body? And
I like that.
But except for I'd be like, what are you talking about?
Right.
Like, what are you talking about? Like we would do a whole session where he would say, okay, do you notice any sensation anywhere? And I'd be, no.
Yeah.
Right. And then I got to the point where I could say, well, it does feel a little tight. And then he'd say, well, just put your hand there for a moment and take a breath. And then when I would do that, there would be a wave of sadness. And then he would say, can you be with that just for a minute? We're not going to stay there. Right. So someone like me and like many people in early recovery, we've been running from our emotions for so long. It might not be that we want to just, sit for 3 hours and feel. It might be, but most likely it's going to be, let me see if I can sit for 3 minutes, 2 minutes, and just see if I can feel something. See if I don't go into a story, because, I don't know if this is your experience, but a lot of times for me in early recovery, I would say I feel sad, and someone would say, have you worked a good 4th and 5th step?
Oh, yeah.
Right. They were like, well, you shouldn't feel sad.
Yeah.
And I've gone to treatment programs where they have on the wall positive and negative emotions.
Yeah.
And as soon as I say this is negative, what do I want to do with it? Get rid of it.
Exactly.
And that's actually addiction. And so people can use recovery in an addictive way. Oh my gosh, don't feel sad. Work a step, talk to your sponsor, go help someone else. All of that can be useful, but there's a place where we must meet ourselves. I remember my first sponsor, Scott, amazing man. And this is way back in the day. We didn't have phones on our,
Yeah.
We had cords,
right,
and phones,
right.
Yeah, and little pieces of paper with everyone's phone number. Yeah. No, not quite, but almost.
Not quite.
Actually, when I was a kid, we had that.
Yeah, me too.
But he said, there will come a moment when no one will answer their phone. And you will need to meet yourself. And those words were so powerful to me. And I remember one time I drove to a meeting, and the meeting wasn't happening and the parking lot was empty. And I remember sitting in my car and thinking, I think this is the moment he's talking about. There was no one to call. We didn't have phones in our car at the time. And I just sat and cried. And that moment was, what happened is I thought, oh, I got through that.
Yeah.
Like I didn't die.
Right.
I actually feel better now that I've cried, and I spent a year trying not to.
Yeah. What do you say to people that struggle with being alone? Because that's a big one too. Codependency, need to be with someone at all times, not being able to face life alone.
Yeah.
And there's different types of alone, right? I'm talking about you're uncomfortable with yourself.
Yeah. Well, that was certainly true for me. My first sponsor told me, that I needed to pick one day a week and not go to a meeting. Like, what are you talking about? I was going to like 13 meetings, 14 meetings a week.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. Oh, wow. And working full time.
Yeah, that's a lot. Overachiever.
Overachiever. Right. And what was that really about? What that was really about is what you're saying. It was very painful for me to be alone with myself. And so at one point he was like, okay, Sundays, you're not going to a meeting. You're just going to be with yourself. And I thought, how is that even possible? So for me, it was just having the commitment to trying I started to become more comfortable over time.
Yeah, that was a long battle for me. And again, it's these last 2-3 years when I've really come into myself and been able to do things that I couldn't do before. And that was one of them, being alone. I love being alone now. Honestly, my circle's really small. Like I do a lot of stuff out, social media, but when I'm not doing that, like I got a little circle and that's it. And I like my alone time. I'll go eat by myself. I was terrified to do that before. There was no way. I've even gone to the movies a couple times by myself, by choice, just to like be with myself.
That used to be my favorite thing, a matinee by myself.
Yeah. Yeah. I love it. Yeah. I encourage everybody to try doing things alone, just little things, and discovering who you are and what you like. A lot of times it can get clouded when you have people around you all the time.
Yeah.
Or jumping into a relationship too soon. What do you think about that? Someone that's in early recovery.
Well, I think, there are multiple layers to this, right?
Yeah.
Because I think it's become dogmatic where it's like you're not allowed to go on a date for a year. You're not allowed to have sex for a year. You're not, all this stuff that can become so rigid.
Yes.
I understand the spirit of it though, right?
Right.
Because it's like, let's not put our focus on someone else. But the truth is, in my experience, we're all doing that to a degree. And it's possible that the relationship will actually help us see that. But I think the wisdom in not jumping into a relationship is, as you said, it's like taking the focus off ourselves, not learning to be alone, not learning to actually address the underlying root causes. Because, as we know, we can shift addictions. Because if we look at a broad definition of addiction, for me, it's anything, anyone, any behavior, any substance that's outside of myself that's trying to numb out or heal something that feels broken within. And so in that way, I could be addicted to reading. Well, it might not cause harm, but I also might be checking out for hours and hours reading, right? So it's like something that seems very innocuous on the surface could be seen as an addiction.
Yeah, and that's the case a lot of times with people. I know for me, when I first got sober, I started working out like crazy. I was probably working out like 3-4 hours a day, doing CrossFit twice a day, and just to the point where my sponsor, because I had a sponsor at the time, I worked a 12-step program, pretty gnarly for the first couple of years. And she's like, you need to tone that down. She's like, I only want you doing that 3 times a week.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, I can't do that. I need to be going for hours a day and doing this and doing that. And I had a lot of body image issues. And so it was really, really tough, but it's what I needed to do because, I feel like trading addictions is so easy, Yeah.
And what's underneath all of that, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And you named it with like, how am I seeing my body? What am I trying to change? And what is the root of that? And as we know, a lot of times, whether it's an eating disorder, I don't like some of these terms, but whether I'm using eating to numb or lack of eating to numb, restriction or over-exercise, it's probably a trauma response on some level, right? And again, it's not like we're looking at we're not looking at that as a bad thing. We're just wondering what's underneath it.
Sorry. Sorry. We edit it. I literally inhaled a piece of fluff or something.
It was good timing for me.
And I got water.
Plus, everyone likes outtakes now.
Yeah. So. We were in a morning meeting. You missed that meeting this morning, and we were talking about doing blooper reels because Chad and Shane down there, those two, it's just like this.
No, I just watched the Hopeaholics podcast back that I was on. Yeah. I didn't even know we were filming.
Oh, yeah,
I didn't know we were.
Just start.
I'm like, are we live?
Yeah.
Like we were in it. We were in the conversation. I had no idea it was happening. So I'm like, oh, there's plenty of bloopers.
They do that intentionally.
Yeah.
Yeah. Trading addictions. No, I'm good. Yeah, we're good. Yeah. Yeah. Hi. Yeah, trading addictions. I mean, you see it all the time. I mean, I also did it with relationships. And again, it all goes back to the trauma. Like for me, sex and love, feeling that validation, which it took me a lot of work to move past that because it was confusing, until I did the work, because it's like, okay, I'm over sexualized. I had this trauma in my life, and then I'm still going out and seeking this behavior, but shouldn't it be the opposite?
Well, it's very complex. I remember our friend Oprah. I used to joke that Oprah was my sponsor. I met with her every day at 4 back when she had her show.
Yes.
That's when I was sort of moving away from 12 steps. So that was my excuse. Like, I still have Oprah as my sponsor. But when she said, one thing that people don't talk about with sexual trauma is that there is a combination of pain and pleasure and shame and secrecy. Right. So there's this, it's like an incubator for these bizarre, multi-layered, complex feelings and then desires that come out of that. Right. And so a lot of times we will say something like, oh, that's really horrible that happened. Well, of course, but there also could be, sometimes people feel really guilty. For example, sometimes people go back for more of that and feel so much shame, and they'll never talk about that. Right. And so obviously as a child, it's never our fault that it happened, but we want to look at what we took away from that. And now how can we start to heal what happened then and the core false beliefs that we developed about ourselves? And again, I'm going back, but like, what frequency are we holding? And so like, it's no surprise that sometimes we will become either hypersexual or shy away from sex.
Yeah.
Like in my case, I separated sex and love for many, many years. I was in these emotional, bizarre, entangled relationships that were not sexual, and I was having sex with people and I didn't even want to know your name.
Yeah.
Right. And that it wasn't until I was in probably close to 20 years sober. I know exactly who it was. The first time I combined those two, I was in my 30s.
Yeah.
And it was terrifying. I mean, I remember literally shaking. And that was absolutely from the trauma.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's not really to be, and this is just this is true for me. It might not be for anyone else. It's not really to be overly analyzed, because I don't think figuring out why is going to get us there.
Yeah.
But to have a place of tenderness for the 3-year-old or the 4-year-old that had this complex, this multi-layered experience with people who I loved.
Yeah. Yeah. And I feel men must suffer more, right? In the sense of like coming out and talking about it. There's a lot of shame that surrounds that. Do you work with a lot of men?
Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't say it's worse,
okay,
because we want to make sure that we're not saying, my trauma is more painful than yours, because everyone has a different experience. But I think what you're asking is very true, that a lot of men are afraid to talk about it.
That's what I meant.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's what I meant, that they're afraid,
So what they do with the trauma is bury it quite often.
Yeah. So how do they find their way back?
I think it's changing now, right? More and more men are talking about it. Men are going through a transformation in my generation. If I look back at my dad's generation, I mean, men were literally taught, you don't feel.
Right.
You
don't cry.
Right.
You work
provide. Hard, provide for your family,
yeah,
be strong, be brave, be smart. Right. It wasn't like, what are you feeling right now? Like my dad and his brothers were sexually abused by their female babysitter, which is uncommon.
Yeah.
Right. And so they had their own trauma that had never been talked about.
Yeah. And that's what I've seen. I know a few men personally that it took a long time to talk about it because of that, shame, embarrassment, and we need to move past that. We need to be talking about it more, being vulnerable.
Well, I think there's also a layer of homophobia. Like if I tell you that happened, even though it happened to me, you might think I'm gay. And then it's like, well, first of all, why is that even an issue? But
yeah, exactly.
So, I mean, that's that we're healing that as well, right? But the idea that we need to be strong and masculine and brave and tough. I mean, I've heard people say, well, couldn't you have fought him off?
Oof.
Right.
Yeah. That's the last thing you want to hear. That's for sure. Yeah.
The least helpful thing.
Definitely least helpful.
Yeah, because we're saying maybe you wanted it.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is kind of part of the bizarre, I guess, experience of sexual trauma is a lot of people blame themselves, even though they intellectually understand it's not their fault. And I think when we're really young, our brains aren't developed enough, and we're very black and white. So if my parent is upset with me, I must be bad. So if my uncle or my neighbor did this to me, I must have wanted it. It's not a intellectual process of understanding that, because as adults we can say, well, of course that's not true, but it doesn't necessarily, or it usually doesn't at all, change the shame around it. Because there's something about being that little and having that happen that creates shame for us, even though we understand we didn't do anything wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. So you have these these are two different books?
That's one book.
Oh, this is one book.
That's one book
Okay.
twice.
It's one, I didn't know, because you had the workbooks. There's different workbooks.
Yes.
What are the workbooks?
So the book is Conscious Recovery, and then there are 4 workbooks. It's Conscious Recovery Workbook for addiction, for eating disorders, for mental health, and for adolescents or for teens.
Okay. Amazing. And how long did it take you to write the book?
Oh, about a week.
No.
It was the book itself, I would say in some ways, I mean, 2 years is actually like from the time I said, okay, I'm going to, because this is my second book and now I have a third one. But from the time I said I'm going to do this until the time it was published was about 2 years. But it was really a lifetime of the experience, my experience working in treatment, coming to my own point of view about what is my perspective on recovery and how do I possibly put it into words.
And what is your perspective on recovery?
Well, I mean, it's in the book, right? So, I mean, I think my perspective on the surface is that recovery is not about, and I already said this, but it's not about moving towards something. It's about returning to something. It's about recognizing that underneath all of our behavior, there's still this place of wholeness. Yeah. And that we came in the world as these precious beings. And recovery is not about how do I learn, it's how do I unlearn? What are all the ideas and the beliefs that I've picked up about myself? What is the energy I'm holding? What are the traumatic events? And when did I disconnect? Yeah. In what way am I carrying shame? And how do I create a safe space within myself enough to start to return to that place of wholeness and pretty much unlearn pretty much everything we've been taught? Yeah.
And it's not a 12-step program. It's not something to replace a 12-step program. Let's make that very clear. This is an addition, and it could be, you don't have to be in recovery, right?
Right. Absolutely. Well, it's funny. My third book, Conscious Creation, I say is Conscious Recovery for Everyone. Okay. But no, it's not a 12-step replacement. It's so funny. The mind is such a trickster, right? Because people say, I don't care what you say. You're trying to replace it. And in no way, it's not a support group. Yeah. I'm pretty clear that I'm not saying let's create a support group that's conscious recovery. There are places, groups of people doing book studies. Most all of those people are in another recovery program. So this isn't a recovery program.
Yeah, I just want to say that because people ask, you know what I mean? And that's not what this is. So you got sober how long ago?
1986.
1986. So back then when you got sober, well, what got you sober?
Well, it's interesting. One of the paradigms I would love to see change in the way we talk about recovery is that you must hit bottom in order to recover.
Right.
Right. Yes. Because what that means usually is some version of, well, maybe it just hasn't gotten bad enough. So go back out there and it can get really bad.
And you can't do that now with fentanyl. You'll die.
Yeah, and exactly.
Like you just can't. Yeah. Because I remember, even not to interrupt you, but just real quick, when I first started working in the clinical space as a case manager, it was like 7 years ago. And that's what I would tell people. Well, you know what? You could just go back out there and if you're not ready, but you can't say that anymore. It's crazy.
We'll come back to the question.
Okay, we'll come back.
But no, I want to
oh, you want to go
there
okay.
Because I remember being maybe 9 months sober. And there was a young woman, just beautiful, young. I was 20, so she must have been 18 or 19 because she seemed young. But I knew her mother and, she came to this sober event and I was so arrogant. And she's like, well, I just don't know if this is for me. And I don't know if I have a problem. And I'm like, well, it says in the big book, just go out and try some controlled drinking if you're not, blah, blah, blah. And she died that night.
Oh no.
And it was before fentanyl, but she and her boyfriend were drunk and passed out with a cigarette.
Oh
and burned their whole house down.
Oh my God.
Right. So there was that moment where I realized, wow, that's not really the answer.
Yeah.
So the reason I'm sharing that is because in some ways on the outside, my life looked okay. In some ways, and I had a job, but what was true for me is that I was in a place of spiritual bankruptcy. And what I mean by that is I felt so damaged and so broken, and drugs and alcohol had brought so much relief. And that last year of my using, I was using ecstasy every day.
Oh, wow.
Or every Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, or Thursday, Friday, Saturday for a year. Not sleeping any at all on the weekends, thinking it was tragically cool to have lost. I mean, I was already 150 pounds, so I was 140 by the end of the weekend, and all of that was so tragic and cool to me.
Yeah.
But what really, I think, was the pivotal moment for me was just this sense of deep emptiness. And a friend of mine had gotten sober and invited me, to come hang out with him at this meeting, right? And I felt so empty. And maybe that's the bottom we're talking about. Maybe it's not about externals. Maybe it's like, I don't know how, we hear this. It's, I don't know how to live. I don't know how to die.
Yeah. I mean, that was it for me. I could have, when I look back, if I'm looking at bottoms, there's 100 of them, there's 100 of them, but it takes that moment. For me, it was that moment of just complete emptiness. And it was a life or death moment. And there were so many other times, but it was in that moment where I knew, and I had a gun, and I said, this is going to go one of two ways. I have a choice right now. I can live or I can die, because life as I know it doesn't exist, and it's over. And I have to make a change. And I had people around me, and my son was in my life, and I still felt that way, just complete and utter emptiness, no sense of self. And I decided that day to make a change, and I went to treatment. But it's our kids, unfortunately, I hate saying it, but they don't keep us sober, right? No one can keep us sober, and no one can get us sober. It has to be us finding that spot of just complete surrender and willingness to make that change. And I think for a lot of us, it's that utter emptiness that we feel.
Yeah. And first of all, I'm grateful that it went the way it did.
Yeah. Thank you.
I mean,
likewise.
I'm so grateful to know you and
you
the work that you're doing. And we do, hopefully take our darkest moments and bring that into a sense of purpose for our lives. Right. I overdosed 6 months before I got sober, but that wasn't enough.
Yeah.
Right. It was that moment that seemed so insignificant. My last drink was just a single Corona, like how uneventful. Right.
Yeah.
But there was that, like I said, that emptiness. And it is true on some level that we can't get someone sober, keep someone sober, but we can be available.
For sure. Absolutely. Yes, we can.
And then I think something that's an interesting segue is I don't think we stay sober for very long on what we don't want. Right. So I hear people saying, well, I never want to forget how bad it was because I don't want to return to it. And I think that shelf life, honestly, I think it's about a week. At some point, and hopefully sooner rather than later, we want to start looking at what we do want. What do I want to create? Because for me, it was not so much, I don't want to feel empty anymore. It's like, I want to feel fulfilled. I want to have enriching relationships. I want to have love in my life. I want to love myself. I mean, even though that's been a multi-year journey, that forward motion, I think, is much more powerful than I just don't want to overdose or feel empty.
I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, I preach it about finding, your passion, your drive, living a purposeful life. What does that look like? Can you speak on that? Living your purpose, finding your purpose?
Yeah. As a matter of fact, in Conscious Recovery, there's a whole section on finding purpose.
Okay,
right?
there you go, you guys.
A lot of times, especially in America, right, it's like, maybe especially in Southern California, right? We're like, your purpose is an action. It's a role that you're going to play. You need to become more of this and more of that, more successful. But for me, purpose is actually more about a quality. And it's a way of being. So it's not so much about doing, but the place where I think it gets really fulfilling and exciting is when we match the being with the doing.
Yes.
And for me, it became profoundly simple. And I'm remembering a moment where it was kind of dark, but not, it was just kind of dark.
Yeah.
And I wrote a personal mission statement. And that mission statement hasn't changed for me.
And what was it?
My mission is to be a catalyst for and a witness to personal and global transformation.
And when did you write that?
2009.
Oh, wow.
I was already working in the field.
Yeah.
I was kind of confused about what I wanted to do. The last thing I thought I was going to do is work in the addiction treatment field. That was not my plan. I did not want to write Conscious Recovery.
Okay. So, well, hold on a second. So how did that happen then?
Well, so, I mean, there's a short and a long version, but what I will say is my plan, my education, I went back to school when I was in my 40s. I got educated in spiritual leadership, and that was what I wanted to do. And I had a spiritual community in San Francisco, and that was my path. And I just sort of, accidentally started working in the field. And as soon as I started working, I was 20 years sober at the time, 20 something years sober. As soon as I started working in the field, I'm like, I want to bring more spirituality to the addiction treatment world. And so I started creating at that time the groups that had become the Conscious Recovery curriculum about helping people really experience themselves and each other. And so I was doing that. And my first book came out 2015, Conscious Being. And then I just started having this awareness that I wanted to write Conscious Recovery. And I said no. I didn't want to be pigeonholed. It's very interesting. That's my mind, right?
Yeah.
But at that point in my, I guess, evolution, I knew to listen to that inner wisdom and that it would lead me up in places that I couldn't imagine and it would be much greater than what I could plan. Right. So I said yes, and I wrote the book, and it's kind of amazing what has transpired since then. Yeah. So that's the short version.
I love that, and I feel like that's what I'm doing in my life right now. And I feel like this is so inspiring for so many people watching, because at any point in your life, you can do these things. It's not like, oh, you got to do them in your 20s or maybe like you can do it at any point that you feel you're being called to do that and to step through that fear and embrace the uncertainty. Right. Yep. and that's what I've done in my life. And it's scary, but I know this is what I'm meant to do, and just living a purposeful life. And I feel like if I get up and do that every day, that everything I want spiritually is going to align with me. And it has. And it's crazy, because when I made this change, said it out loud, like all these doors opened up for me. Right. And they weren't before, right? Because I was still in that other space. But as soon as I made that conscious decision, everything opened up. And God was like, well, here you go. Yeah. It's about time.
Well, and what's interesting is when I listen to inner wisdom, and for me, that what's required for me is to have time in meditation and listen to that inner voice, not this. Because I have all kinds of ideas about what I should be doing, what the world should look like, and my 60 and 90-day plan.
Yeah.
But when I listen to that and this spark, it's like a spark of divinity. It's a divine idea. And when I listen to that and just let it be, I wonder what that's wanting to be. And then I get in touch with the purpose, because, it's easy for me, it's easy to go into the action steps around how to create something. But when I remember the deeper why of what is this really about? I mean, what is Conscious Recovery really about?
Yeah.
It's really about providing this message to as many people as possible that you're inherently whole and perfect. That all of your behavior has been about a lie that you have developed about yourself. And that recovery can be about returning home. And when I remember the simplicity of that, and as you said, then I tune into that, and then doors start opening. Like all these things start happening that seem miraculous. But in truth, that's the way the world works. When I get clear about who I've come here to be, and for me, it almost always involves helping others in some way. Then the doors start opening.
Yeah, and I feel when we live our truth and in that space and we're vulnerable in that space, other people feel safe in that space too. I've had so many people reach out to me going, oh, you doing this motivated me to do this, or I'm looking more at this. And it just creates this ripple effect of energy. that we put out there. I'm going to actually go home and start. I haven't read your book from start to finish. I'm going to go home and start reading this tonight. I'm excited. And I need to order the other 2 books. They're both out? You have all 3. Okay. And are you working on a new one right now? No. You planning on it?
Okay, so here's what I'll say about that, because I'm not going to say absolutely
your
no.
reaction was,
I'm like, I don't have a plan to write another book.
Yeah, but
at some point there might be more of an autobiographical piece that's really talking about like what led to all of this.
Yeah,
but I still have this idea of who would be interested in that, which is interesting because we all love each other's stories, right?
Right. Yeah.
We all love like it's great to have these books. It's great to do what I do, but like, what led to that? What's the light and the dark and the ups and the downs that led to the knowing of who I've come here to be, right? And that's the common story for all of us. My story is not unique. So I'm sure it'll happen at some point.
I'm sure it will.
I'm hoping someone will write it for me.
Hey, you never know.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. You're amazing. I love you.
I love you.
I love everything about you. Your energy is just like, I feel like I've taken what would you call it? Like a sound bath right now. You're like a sound bath.
Oh.
Yeah, you are.
That means so much to me because that's exactly what Mary Helen was for me.
Oh.
Right?
Yeah.
She was
did you say that? Is that where I got it from?
No.
You didn't say that
I didn't,
during
but
this
I
interview.
love it.
Huh. Well, thank you.
Thank you, Jenny.
All right, you guys, check out Conscious Recovery. Oh, where can people find you?
I would say let's go do consciousrecovery.com.
Okay, consciousrecovery.com. Get your book today. All right. Bye, you guys. Thank you.